You're listening to Criticaleye's Inspiring Leaders podcast. Criticaleye is a global membership community with over 2 decades of experience supporting senior executives in their roles. We work with board-level executives, giving them opportunities to build their knowledge, skills, and access independent reference points outside of their immediate networks. Whether you're stepping up into a more senior role or aspiring to do so, looking to hone high-level stakeholder relationships, drive operational performance, build your own personal resilience as a leader, or have longer-term career goals such as moving into a plural career, Criticaleye's approach supports a range of leadership challenges and ambitions.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Criticaleye's Inspiring Leaders podcast. My name is Ambrose Willson, editor here at Criticaleye. Today we're going to be exploring how leadership teams and boards can succeed in creating value under private equity ownership. Working with PE is known to be intense and fast-paced, particularly when it comes to the exit period. But it is a tried and tested route to building value for founders, executives, and of course the PE investors as well. So I'm joined by two guests with decades of collective experience within the PE space, albeit with slightly different lenses. Martin Balaam is the CEO and founder of Pimberly, which operates in the SaaS space and has recently expanded internationally with the help of venture capital backing. Martin also took his previous business on a successful journey of PE ownership, achieving over 3 times returns on the exit. I also have Jacqui Summons with me. Jacqui has vast experience working across PE and the public markets, firstly as a CPO during her executive career, and more recently working with PE houses as a non-executive director, and most notably with the HR solutions provider Zealous Group. And in this role, Jacqui contributed specifically around the people agenda and right up until the business was sold to Apax last year. So a huge amount of experience in the PE world between the two of you. And Martin, you've been involved in PE businesses for over 20 years. Can I start by asking for your reflections on how the industry has sort of changed and developed during this time? Has it become more mainstream, for want of a better term?
Yeah, so I'll come back to the mainstream point, but I guess in summary, I think yes, it has in terms of do people is it a niche sort of growth funding product or not? And I think most people have it on their agenda at some point. But in terms of how things have changed, certainly back in the day, you usually didn't bump into PE unless you knew somebody that was in it. And even then it was fairly mystical, and you were either in it or you weren't in it, as it were. And also it was fairly formulaic as well. It was very debt driven then, back leverage. They talked all about times about how to get more leverage on the deals, but then as you go through the various economic cycles, and I'm sure, as people can see from myself and Jacqui's, we're fairly experienced people, so we'll have been through at least 3 sort of down cycles in our time. And usually what that means is that in an economic downturn, access to leveraged debt is pretty scarce. And so over the time, my 20 years, I've definitely seen PE evolve from being more mechanical to being definitely more sort of a full service, let's say, where it used to be, well, unless we can get this amount of debt in the business, it's not a deal we want to do, to actually no, we like that business, we like the industry, we think it's well positioned, we're prepared to take a more of a realistic term view on it, and also we're prepared to actually fund it both from a debt and an equity point of view. So those are the things that I feel has changed. It's moved from PE being a fairly niche, narrow product, let's say, if you want to be so thing like that, to being more of a sort of a place or a partner that you could go to that for very specific reasons, i.e. that you want to grow and you want to do something with the business. But and it's always like risk and return, isn't it? There's that growth comes with risks, but also the returns. And the risks are that ultimately you've got to stick by and deliver your plan, or you can't just put a plan in place and think, oh well, never mind, we didn't achieve it. Let's draw up another plan. That's just not an acceptable situation. But I prefer having. I prefer working in environments where you are answerable to somebody other than just yourself.
Yeah, yeah. And with that in mind, Martin, what does success look like today in PE? Obviously, you talked about value creation already. So, what's your approach to that as a CEO?
Yeah, so I think certainly, if you look at ultimately, PE funds are investment funds, and they're invested in by either high net worth individuals directly, or more often than not, pension funds, or funds of funds, etc. And ultimately, it's what drives their returns and their requirements. And certainly over the last sort of 20 years, it's been more than just about a financial return. Clearly that's there because that's ultimately, it's mine and your, ultimately it's our pensions that are in these places, and we expect that those pensions are relatively safe and grow at least more than inflation.
Mm,
However, increasingly we care about the types of businesses that they do invest in, and whether those businesses are sustainable, whether they're open and diverse and allow all people and talents to flourish, etc., and have a purpose. And I think PE have reflected that as well. You'll see that PE really do care just as much about whom they're investing in, as well as just the opportunity for financial return. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, you've got to pass that financial return sort of gate. But then if you really want to be attractive, you've got to have that purpose, and you've got to have a reason for being, and being a open and inclusive business.
mm. Yeah, thank you, Martin. Jackie, I'll bring you in now. From your perspective as a former CPO first, how do you feel that HR leaders contribute to the value creation journey?
Yeah, well, it probably won't surprise you to hear me say that I think they're critical to that journey. I think that's under-recognized often by some PE houses, and I'll sort of return to that point in a moment. But if you think about the sort of key things that you'd expect your CPO to be thinking through, particularly around talent acquisition, I think is crucial through the journey. Really looking out for the key critical employees and helping to find ways to retain those through, what can sometimes be rocky. It's not always a straight line. So there are definitely ups and downs there. And then sort of around the whole employee engagement piece, because I think, and again, this is perhaps something to kind of return to later, but there is, I think, a really odd relationship sometimes between this full employee base and the PE house in terms of their real understanding of what's going on. And I've heard employees talk about the fact that they don't want to be in a business that is going through a cycle and will end up selling. So it's kind of really that piece of engagement I think it becomes really critical. I think because and I liked Martin's description of being answerable to someone other than myself. And I think I probably also like that part of it, the fact that from an HR point of view, I think it forces the HR director, the CPO, to think about what are the things that are really critical to this business being successful, not just the whole gamut of things that you could potentially get involved in. So I think, the CPO plays a really important role in focusing the business on the areas that are critical to that particular business. And I think the final thing around that is the relationship between the CPO and the CEO and maybe other exec members as well. I've always played that role very much as a coach to the CEO and to the team. I think that's made a significant difference. Again, through bumpy times, that's been helpful, I think, for everybody to kind of have that role being played. And so I come sort of full circle to say, I think that it's so important, but it's sometimes given less credence when the PE house is looking to bring the team together initially. Some really focus on the CPO role, but others don't focus on it. The current business that I'm involved in has had 4 or 5 CPOs in 5 years. And I think that has actually done some significant damage to the business during that period. It's not been something the PE house is particularly focused on.
Yeah, no, lots of really interesting stuff that we can return to, I think. But you've also got the non-executive lens as well, Jacqui. So I wanted to ask, what do you think are the characteristics of a high-performing board when there are representatives from the PE house involved at the boardroom?
Yeah, I think I can only really reflect on my own experience on this one, and it may not be typical. I, at Zealous, played a role that was, I clearly wasn't part of the executive team. I wasn't fully part of the PE house either. I think in many ways, as a non-exec, I really played that very independent role. I was often the voice of the customer. So certainly because of my background and because they were focused on selling to the HR community, then I had an important part to play, sometimes almost in just bringing them back to reality. You might want to do all these things, but actually CPOs won't care if you do those things, but they will care if you do those. I think within the boardroom, the way that sort of played out sometimes was just to add a different focus, a different lens. My feeling sometimes was that it was kind of so driven around, the improvements that need to be made financially. And to Martin's point, which is critical, obviously, that you are looking to make money without a doubt. I think sometimes that can overwhelm other parts of the conversation, which would be much more about, where should we as a business really be focusing and what's going to be important for the longer term future of this business as well. So I thought that was an interesting part. But whether my role was typical of all non-exec roles in PE, I'm not sure actually, but that's how it played out for me.
Okay, and Martin, would you like to build on that in terms of looking at PE boards and what is expected of the executive team from the PE reps and also sort of the non-executives working to support the execs?
Yeah, so just on that point that Jacqui said, I think whilst PE can be a bit formulaic, the actual value that you get from the business, whether you're getting into a deal or out of a deal, it's fundamentally driven by two factors. One is the relative metric that you value is measured on, and usually that is profitability. EBITDA, most people talk about. If you're in SaaS, it might be multiples of ARR. And then the other thing is then your sort of EV, your value, your multiple of that, and that is really where you benchmarked against your peers, and that multiple is based more around the quality of your business than it is around, so your metric is your EBITDA, your value, and a PE house looks to increase both. It looks to get profitability from A to B, but also the quality of the business from C to E. And that quality, picking up Jacqui's point, is all about, it's fundamentally driven by people. What is the quality of the leadership team? What is the quality of the team below the leadership team? We are looking ultimately, PE don't look at their 5 to 7 year horizon. They look at the time after that, because they need to exit with just an even more exciting growth story for the next buyer. And that means that the team, if you're moving into this, you're either up for incredible sort of like two-stage sort of this time and next time, or you've got the depth in the business to be able to do that, so that if anybody wants to step off at the next time, the people around them or underneath them are ready to step up, as it were. So that I think that's really interesting, that people need to remember, is that it's the quality of the business, and not just the actual relative metric that you've moved from A to B, that ultimately determines the value of the entity. In terms of, your specific questions around execs and at the board and non-execs. So I think if I pick up the non-exec first, I think if you've never had a non-exec on your board or advisor, then probably you need to question why that is, because it is going to be a cultural difference for you. And I know when I talk to some of my peers, they'll see it with some sort of level of resistance. Well, we've never had any, busybody, nosy person sitting around our board or before or whatever. But then I'd flip it on the head and I'd say, so you know everything, do you? You know everything about sales. You know everything there is to know about HR, about talent retention, about customer success, about, net promoter score. You know everything then, do you, around? And of course they don't. And you say, so had you have cared about these things, perhaps you might have considered having an advisor on board for specific areas, which is no different to what what a PE house is looking for. So it's just, and for me, as when you setting this scene in terms of a non-exec, so, you've got to define what their role is so that everybody's clear. So, and usually as a minimum, there'll be a chairperson that, and there might be additional advisors as well, and those advisors might be, well, actually, we're trying to open up in this geo. Well, we're actually going to bring on, the PE house might recommend you bring on an advisor who's got huge experience in doing that, can open doors for you, etc., etc. But that advisor or non-exec, whatever you want to call them, knows their remit is that. The chairperson's usually is a bit of a combination. It will be, for sure, it'll be the governance piece, which is the sort of the bridging the communications gap between you as the CEO and the execs, and the private equity house, because there's a lot, they've got a completely different language to what you have, and also you got to remember they've got a portfolio of customers. They cannot just concentrate just on you. They will have done during the process to sort of like win you over and invest in you, but thereafter you then move into BAU, just like you would do with a customer, when you're winning a big client. And so the chair there is the chairperson there is to bridge that gap, as well as usually bringing in a specific skill set of their own. From an exec point of view, it is quite an interesting time, because first of all, if you don't think you're going to be concerned or whatever, or worried, that then I think you're kidding yourself, because everybody, when you enter a deal, is worried, in terms of, well, what do they really think of me? Do they really like me? And you get a little bit of imposter syndromes creeping in and whatever. And that is where, again, your chairperson, your non-exec, is there to help deal with those natural feelings of, and you as a CEO or whatever, naturally might not have those, because that's not usually in your trait, but certainly your team will feel that. And you might, like me, I've been through so many Myers-Briggs things. I know that I'm not terribly empathetic, so, but I'm old enough now to know that I don't know about things like that. And again, that's where I look to my chairperson to sort of like understand what is the feeling, what's going on, what are the things that I'm doing that aren't great from a behavioural point of view, and also as well as just the sort of like pointing out the usual sort of normal things in terms of your KPIs and whatever. So it's if you've never had non-execs before, it is going to be culturally different, but in a positive way. And if you're not even thinking about PE at the moment and you don't have non-execs, ask yourself, why don't you? Do you really know everything about everything? And obviously the answer is going to be no.
Yes, of course. Jacqui, I'll bring you in here. I wonder if, you have any good examples of perhaps, the chair performing that go-between role between the PE house and the CEO and the exec team.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I've got experiences of it being done really, really well. And I've got experiences of it being done really badly, but not actually the fault of the chair, but just the role that the PE house wanted the chair to play, I think, can sometimes be interesting. But yeah, go between is a good description. I think lots of people talk about the importance of connecting the exec team and the PE house. I think it takes significant skill on the part of the chairman. I'd sort of call out a few specifics on that. One is communication, I think, is the key one, and that sounds almost trite to say, and it almost seems obvious. But the way in which the chair, communicates things to the CEO that have come from the PE house and vice versa in a sort of accurate way without creating issues between the two. Again, when things are difficult, I guess my experience more recently has been when things have been difficult, it's easy to get that communication wrong, I think, and not to be clear. So I think that's one. I mean, trying to maintain that sort of degree of independence. So, a go-between doesn't take sides. In my mind, it's very much trying to really properly understand where the CEO is coming from, really properly understand where the PE house is coming from, and then trying to kind of work between the two. If they're really well aligned, perhaps less of an issue, but where they're not well aligned, I think that sort of degree of being seen as independent is important, particularly from the CEO's point of view. I think quite often the chair can act as a coach to the CEO and builds that relationship. But I've also worked very closely with chairs myself. And so the relationship has been actually through me to the CEO and using me in that sort of more coaching role. So I think that's an interesting one to think about if you have a chief people officer, is how you kind of work with that person in the business as well. Particularly if you're in a situation where the CEO is not really readily valuing the coaching that's coming from the chair, which I've also seen happen as well. And I think the final piece is the chair really, and this is a difficult one, but properly understanding what's going on in the business, not exclusively coming from what the CEO is telling him or her. So, and what I mean by that is that I've kind of seen CEOs and executive teams do quite a good job in delivering information in a certain way to a chair, which actually covers quite a lot of the stuff that's going on in the business, being really frank about it. And the chair, to really understand the business, kind of has to delve deeper in and really get to know what's going on. And even that, it can be tricky. You rely on some people that you've got to know and you've got to trust in the business. They may not be necessarily giving you the full picture either. And I think that's one of the things that I've seen, work well and work less well is how much the chair is able to really understand what's going on day to day in the business. So I guess they would be some of the things that I would pick up.
Yeah. Thank you, Jacqui. I suppose when you're talking about times where there's perhaps conflict of opinions or maybe misalignment between the two parties, all of those insights just take on, even more importance. So, Martin, what's the best way to manage those situations, from your experiences, would you say?
Well, I think from an exec's point of view, an exec team's point of view, it's to be clear. Let's say there is usually this is around ultimately either not doing the things that you said that you'd agreed that you'd do in the first sort of 90, 180 days, or further down the road, it's that if you're not achieving plan significant, materially, or you're starting to do things that weren't originally envisaged in the plan. So I think from an executive's point of view or the team's point of view, you got to be pretty clear about what it is that you're doing. Being able to articulate that at the board, have that plan, have your plan, have it written down. If things aren't going well, be pretty clear about what you not in denial, because that's the biggest thing I think that most people, and where they're, to be fair, on the chair, that's where the chair should be sort of stepping in and making sure that teams aren't in denial about where the trajectory is taking them, because usually if you've missed it, it's too late. It's the trajectory. And then it's as an executive team acknowledging that there's an issue, agreeing between yourselves what you're going to do about it, putting that forward and saying these are our actions. Because at the end of the day, the PE house and all the chair are there to run your business. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, they will step in and run it if they have to. But that is a doomsday scenario. But certainly, being open, being applying yourself, and also asking for help. If you think, what, we've tried everything, we think, we need help. That's one of the things that PE houses are there to do. That's what they're supposed to bring to you. Is that you can't expect them to be all over your numbers and be there before you, because that would mean they're running your business with you. But if you genuinely think, what, we've tried everything to do this, or we can't recruit this person, or we can't, we've thrown everything at trying to open up this new product or this new geo, whatever, and it's just not working for us. We need, and then sort of turn to the PS and say, how can you help us? Who else has done this in the portfolio? Who is it that you would suggest that we reach out to, for independent advice on this, for example? So I think the main thing is to be on top of things, be open, but also make sure that you've got an action plan if things aren't going the way they should be, that you're delivering on it. And if it's still not getting the results you want, don't be afraid to ask.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. I mean, ultimately, in PE, success is defined by the value created during the ownership cycle at the time of the exit. So, Martin, how front of mind should the exit be, at all times of that cycle for the leadership team?
I think that it seems to me sort of, if you assume, you're looking at a 5 to 7 years sort of cycle, your first sort of let's say 2 years are going to be at maybe even 3 years if you're looking at acquisitions as well, are going to be all about really pushing hard on growth. So what are the areas that we identified before PE, during the PE process for growth? Because you'll have had to put forward a plan of growth, because that's where it's backed on. You'll be then executing against that plan. And then ultimately, probably in year 3 to year 4, that's really when you should be, if everything's going okay, you'll be starting to you should be proactively talking to the PE house along with your chairperson about, right, okay, what are our timelines? What are your timelines? And then, what are our exit strategies, in terms of, because don't forget, it's the PE house that wants/needs to exit. not necessarily you guys and girls, so you might choose, or some of you might want to stay on and do it again, and therefore you're looking for because most PE sales is to another PE. I don't know what the stat is, but it's probably way over 50%. Some very few are on get taken public, and the big chunk obviously is that where it's exited to a trade buyer, as in a complete exit, as it were. And so don't be afraid. In fact, proactively ask. You ideally, when you go into a deal, you should understand what the PE house's required return is. They'll tell you what that is. And if they won't, then just look on their accounts, and it tells you on their accounts what their target rate of return is and what they typically get for a business like you. So you can sort of work out backwards when you're at the right time for them to be able to achieve their exit. I'd talk to them and make sure that you're in control of that. But if you don't talk about it, then it will happen to you because they have to ultimately exit.
Yeah. Okay. And Jacqui, any reflections from your side? You've obviously also been involved in full cycles and specifically around the exit, and really from your experience, what's the secret to success during that highly emotive and stressful, busy period?
Yeah, so just picking up on one of the things that Martin said, I agree that in that sort of cycle there are definitely different phases. And I think, from in the very early point in the first 2 to 3 years, you're probably no one's going to have an exit so much front of mind as they will in the latter part. But I think, and again, I think I talked about this earlier, how that plays out with the employees themselves in the business and also below the executive team with your sort of senior leadership team, I think is important, because what sort of seems to happen is, in certainly the business I've been in, you get close to that sort of 4 to 5 year mark. And if you're not clear and communicating within your business what's going on, people kind of make their own assumptions. And I was quite surprised, almost horrified recently in a business when, asking people in the senior leadership team, one in particular, about acquiring people in his team and really challenging the people in his team and probably making some significant changes was what was required. And the view back was, I decided not to do that because we're kind of close to an exit. And that seemed just like on every level a bizarre answer. One, because there's clearly expected value beyond that point anyway. Secondly, I don't think there was any real sort of communication to that effect that had come that person's way. But people sort of make their own assumptions about these things if you don't talk about it. And one of the reasons I think people avoid it with employees in particular is, well, they'll be kind of nervous about the fact that we're going to have to go through an exit. But I think to Martin's point, actually, if you're talking about it being important that the value is created beyond that point, then actually people are not nervous about it because they kind of see it as part of a continuation, not as something which comes to an end. So I do think that relationship is with employees is important, and how you communicate through the period. I actually, having been through a few exits now, I find it personally quite useful in most of the things I do of any importance to imagine I'm talking about that as part of an exit. And what I mean by that is, when I'm making decisions and things that I think we want to do from a cultural point of view or from a policy point of view or a legal point of view or any of those things, I always think sometimes it's helpful to think of myself in a management team talking to a potential buyer. How would I describe it? And it's kind of kept me with one eye on that exit and meant that when it's come to that point, I haven't been sort of overly caught out by things.
Yeah.
It's probably because very early on, I had an experience where I hadn't been through that process at all. When it came to the end point, when it came to the sort of due diligence point of view, I had many moments where I thought, I really wish we hadn't done it in that way, because now we're needing to describe it. So maybe just experience has made me kind of realize that I keep that more front of mind than perhaps people who haven't been through it before might do. I guess that's true. In terms of you came on to ask about the secret during an exit period. And the really weird thing about it is the more difficult the exit, the closer the executive team seems to come, in my experience. So I've been through 2 really difficult exits. One wasn't PE, it was a listed business, but we went through the CMA phase 2 process, which for anyone that's been through that, that's quite an arduous thing to go through. But on the PE side, one particular business, it took about a year and 3 failed sales before we finally got it across the line. And the kind of the impact on the executive team was incredible, in terms of people actually became incredibly close working through that period of ups and downs. But the thing that I remember more than anything from that one was the CEO. So however difficult the situation was, however bad we often felt when we came in after the latest failure, he would literally just say, right, okay, so, we go again, we start again and think about it. So it was that kind of always looking to what are we doing next? And also at the same time, really keeping the business operating well, keeping the communication channels open with employees, not going into a little dark huddle where everyone was thinking what on earth's going on, but trying to keep all the normal stuff and activity going during that period was really key as well. So that would be my perspective on it.
Yeah. Martin, do any of those recollections chime with your own experiences when it comes to the exit period?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly, you've got to, I mean, I've had them similar where, I think we'd got some advisor that had convinced our PE house they could get the value that they wanted a year early. And of course, experience now I'd always say, well, no, I don't think so. But anyway, we went down that route, and it was and then it didn't happen. So then you got to pick the team up, and
Yeah.
it's a lot of work. And then they're all out there ordering the Ferraris or whatever. No, I'm joking, but you know what? They've got that going through their head as well. And then you got to pick them up and say, right, okay, heads down. But no, back to the point about PE. I guess because I've done it a few times now, I'm not frightened of being really open now with my staff about PE as a transient investor. I sort of it's no different to, I know this might sound a little bit weird, but no different to moving offices. You've got your offices, you spend a lot of time looking for them, you do them up when you've got them, and you really love them when they're there. But at some point you outgrow them. And hopefully, but it's similar. I have no issue talking to my staff about, our investors. I also, right from the outset, will set the scene that they are in here for a fixed period of time. They are the pension funds ultimately, that this is what they do, because a lot of people don't realize it's their money that they're paying into that ultimately is invested in us. They have to get out, and then at some point we'll be looking for the next investors. So now what I wouldn't do is say, oh, I can't wait to sell because then I can get rid of you all and whatever, because basically that's never what I think anyway. That's not what I want. So yeah, so it is about, if you feel that you can be open about the fact that you've got these incredible people, this is who they've invested in before, this is the amazing things that these businesses have gone on to do, and we're now part of their portfolio and cohort and whatever, and it's it's an exciting, proud thing to be of. Certainly, I know some people will even mention it, silent. If they could get away with not having any PR, they would do, as it were. So I don't think that way at all. But in terms of going through an exit, and with the other thing I've learned now, and I always do, is keep my data room up to date every year. I get my FD gets an intern data room redone, kept up to date. Because it's incredibly boring to do it. And if you actually get an intern or two in each year, you can just add your latest customer contracts, employee contracts, all that really dross stuff. But the other thing is, it reminds you that ultimately you're going to go through a sale process.
Yeah.
And taking to Jacqui's point about when you're making decisions, where you're doing certain things, when you're looking at certain products, it sort of again always keeps in the back of your mind. I have to. This has to be understandable to a new third party investor, as it were, that's going to come in and making sure that you can do that. So I've found for not a lot, and in any event, it's always a great sort of thing, to have something meaningful for an intern to do rather than just hanging around, sort of doing not a lot, to actually do something, and it also they're touching pretty much all the managers, and it reminds them that that this is a real thing. So those are some of the things that I've done or learnt to do.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Look, we've probably got time for one more question. So I'd like to ask each of you what it's actually like working in PE setups at the moment. Is there more pressure on leadership teams given that margins are finer across the board due to the landscape that we're living through at the moment? And Martin, I'll come to you first.
I don't think there's more pressure per se. I think that pressure was always there. At the end of the day, the pressure is like what I said right at the beginning, that ultimately there's somebody else that you got to answer to. Now, some people might have debt in the business and they've got some covenants and whatever, but that's not the same thing. You're setting out a strategy and you going and executing against that strategy to the best of your ability. And I think, if you feel that you're going to thrive under that sort of enhanced sort of pressure, then you'll do really well, regardless. I think that if I know, the other thing to remember is that you're not unique. So everybody else, when we talk about thin margins or, everybody's faced with the same issues in it's just how you deal with them and what you do about it. That's the difference between you and your competitor, and, whether you'll be just as attractive, if not more attractive next time round to the next new investor.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Martin. And Jacqui, any sort of final reflections on the PE landscape at the moment, and how, I guess, do you and your colleagues cope with the pressure of working with PE?
Yeah, I think it's not for everybody, and to echo Martin's point, I think I'm not sure that I've seen it become more pressurized. I think I've worked in and around PE maybe for 20 odd years, and it felt just as much. There felt to be just as much pressure earlier on. I often have conversations with CPOs that have had a different career and thinking about going into PE, and I do sometimes say that it's not everybody's ideal working scenario, because I think you've got to relish being challenged and being asked sometimes for information that you might not readily have provided in the past, and it will be scrutinized. And for some people, I actually enjoy that. I wouldn't choose necessarily to be in other types of businesses. I enjoy that feeling of accountability. But for it's not for everybody, and I think sometimes people see the potential reward of PE, and they forget that actually there's an awful lot of work that goes into that reward, and it's by no means guaranteed as well. So you could easily spend 5 to 7 years and not really reap the benefit of that. So I think you've got to be really cognizant of that as well. So not for everybody, but certainly something that I've really enjoyed in my career.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Thank you, Jacqui, and thank you, Martin, for summing up the conversation so well. I will wrap it up now, as I think we've covered a fair bit of ground there, mostly looking at how leaders can succeed and create value within private equity structures. So, just want to say thank you again. And if you want to listen to more episodes of our Inspiring Leaders series, you can find them on all the good podcast spots, Podbean, Spotify. But that's all we have time for this episode. So thanks again, and bye for now.